Hello and welcome and happy Packtober, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here to celebrate 10 years of Pact. So I won't bore you with details about me. I'm going to introduce our fantastic speakers. So we've got Bas Dijkstra, we've got Dave Farley and Lewis Prescott. I will just run you through our agenda quickly for today. So we've got an hour with this wonderful panel, so we'll spend 5 minutes. We'll just let the team introduce themselves, and then we've kind of got 4 topics for discussion. We'll talk about the origins, both of the panel's career and kind of how they got into contract testing, some kind of tips around adoption. We'll see if we can eke out some words of wisdom for our panel as well, and then we'll kind of take a look at what the future of testing and quality and software development look like. And then hopefully we will be brimming with questions. So we'll open it up to the floor to everyone, and we'll also invite our existing members who are here to throw in some questions. So without further ado, I will drop my slides and I will throw over to, we'll pick it at random, we'll go for Lewis.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, I'm Lewis. I'm currently a quality engineering lead at Isla Care, which is a healthcare startup based out of London. Been involved in contract testing for quite a while now, getting involved with Pact and sharing my knowledge all over the place. So yeah, great to be here, and obviously a privilege to be around the people that you've got here today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lewis. Dave, thank you for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. I was just watching yourself on YouTube with Seb Rose, who introed us at the start of Packtober. So yeah, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Dave Farley. I'm these days I'm an independent consultant and loudmouth on YouTube, I suppose. I run a YouTube channel about software engineering, testing of all kinds, and so on. And I'm an author of several books, including Continuous Delivery Book and Modern Software Engineering.
Awesome, incredible. And last but not least, we've got the wonderful Bas. Could we tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me, Saf. It's good to see you. My name is Bas Dijkstra, so you almost didn't butcher my last name. Well done.
I tried.
Awesome. Sorry. I'm a bit like Dave, but then also not like Dave. I'm an independent consultant, trainer in most things automation these days, but with a specific focus on API integration and definitely also contract testing. So I do some consulting, I do some training, I do some blogging here and there, I do some speaking, a little bit of everything really. And yeah, I'm very, like the others, I'm very excited to be here. And congratulations on making it 10 years.
I know, I'm absolutely thrilled. Thank you. I joined, I think the Pact kind of open source community back in 2017. So much like Matt, I feel like I'm riding on the coattails of others, but I think I suppose you probably all found in your career that we're forever standing on the shoulders of giants, those before us who've kind of tread great steps. So let's, without further ado, let's drop into our questions. So first topic I've got is origins. So I'd like to learn a little bit maybe about when did you first kind of hear about contract testing, or maybe when did it form part of your kind of quality strategy? And yeah, kind of, I know you guys all talk about it, but yeah, when was that kind of light bulb moment in your career? Feel free, anyone, to take this.
In all honesty, I'm not sure if that light bulb has switched on yet. What I do see is that I sort of try, by doing it a lot and talking about it a lot and reading about it a lot, my story continuously evolves, and I find myself every day, I find myself being a little bit less bad at explaining what contract testing is and the kinds of problems that it tries to solve. So and I was thinking, in preparation for this, I was thinking about where did I first heard about Pact, and I honestly can't remember. So I think I've heard about the term of contract testing a long while ago, and then I don't really understand this. And then Pact came in. I think I got into touch with Matt at some point, and we did a bit of back and forth, and started reading up on what is this new thing, what is this Pact thing, what's the problems that it's trying to address, and I sort of kind of slowly grew into that.
So like as your test strategy, you look at kind of test automation and kind of the full strategy. Was there a certain point where you weaved it in, or
like so I talk and train and consult quite a bit on so I try to avoid UIs wherever I can. It's unfortunately a lot of my clients say, well, oh no, UIs are fantastic, we should all do all of our automation through the UI. I talked and I've been doing a lot around API testing and automation for a while, and it sort of kind of was like a natural progression. It's about once our systems get larger and we have more components that communicate with one another, it's always the question that question of, are all of these individual components able to talk to one another, is going to get harder and harder and harder to answer. And I ran into that before I was introduced to Pact, and that's well, here's Pact, and this is a technique, contract testing supported by tools, Pact, and later on also Pact Flow, that tries to address that problem. So it's sort of kind of weaved itself into the story and into the things that I've been doing.
Fantastic. And Dave, I know that you've been in the software development industry. You've got lots of experience under your belt. You talk about, the full continuous delivery life cycle, and I suppose contract testing plays some part of that in that for you. So where did it kind of come onto your radar?
Sure. So I like lots of these things. I've been practicing versions of continuous delivery for a very, very long time, longer than it was called continuous delivery. And so as a result of like much of the practice that I talk about, it's really pragmatic. The way that I came across contract testing is because I had problems that I couldn't solve, and I needed some way of defending boundaries of my system that I didn't know how to do. So my first exposure to contract testing was rolling our own contract tests. So I was building a large financial exchange, and we wanted to isolate the exchange so we could test the rest of the exchange and leave the external integration points alone and not involve those in the testing. So we built some contract tests for those points that we ran. The first time that I came across Pact was, I remember fairly clearly, I think it was at a conference, and it was at a conference not very long after Pact was new, and somebody was presenting the ideas of this new framework for organizing contract testing. And so I was kind of intrigued by that and interested in that. I confess, hand on heart, I've never actually used Pact in a project because of my experience of rolling my own and doing my own thing. Yeah. Although I think it's a remarkably important tool and useful. And I was at another conference recently, and I saw Seb talking about the Pact broker and the problem of all of the different dimensions of testing, how you test multiple versions and all of the different kinds, and the way in which Pact can help with those sorts of problems. And that's a real world problem that I face all of the time in consultancy. So although I've not actually used it personally on my own projects, partly because I haven't done any projects of that kind for a long time myself, I've advised people and helped people use it and introduced it to quite a lot of different places now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point though, Dave, because it's it's a technique and a mindset shift. So I think, you know, Sam was talking about the mindset, and you can apply those techniques without PACT. You can apply behavior-driven development without using Gherkin, and it's quite easy to roll your own, but then you sometimes have to deal with, now that you have these contracts, how do you associate those contracts with your versions of your software? And the matrix, I think, was definitely the kind of shining jewel in the crown of PACT. Thanks for that. I will pass over to Lewis and just find out where he first kind of, so Lewis has worked as a QA lead, so I think he's had lots of seen firsthand some of the challenges of integrating multiple services, and at some point PACT or contract testing came onto your radar, and I actually met you through common friends in the Ministry of Testing. So yeah, I'd love to hear about how it kind of came to be. Yeah, so like I got introduced to it like probably 5-6 years ago from a CTO that I worked with, and I was doing API testing at the time using JavaScript, Supertest, like traditional integration testing. And I can, like, when he introduced me the concept, I just couldn't get my head around the fact that, okay, but we've built the service, like why we have like consumers, we already have these tests which test the integration. So it wasn't until a couple of years later when I worked for ASOS where we had lots of large distributed teams working on each of their siloed microservices, where I really saw the value of it. And that's where I started to implement PACT. And yeah, understanding that it's the communication. And I think like Sam touched on this in his talk a lot, and like it's a lot of what I talk about as well, is like it's those communication starters. It's those points where you have that human aspect where you need this tool, like PACT comes in and it goes, look, this is what I'm talking about. This is the programming language. And then PACT gives you that human aspect of this is how I start the conversation. So yeah, that was where I really like started to click for me. It was like, okay, I've got all these distributed teams and like I have no idea what their service does. I have no idea how they use our service. That's when I started to really see the value of it. Awesome.
I'd like to add something to that, if I may.
Yeah, please.
I think Lewis makes an important point. I'm an old school OO programmer, and one of the light bulb moments for object orientation for me was I was building this system and I suddenly realized that all of the pieces were really simple, and the cleverness of the system was in the conversation between the pieces. It was the messages that mattered, the conversations. And I think that one of the things it's easy, you know, if we talk about tools like PACT and focus on those, they're great tools, but tools aren't enough. And this is part of an architectural approach where you're dividing up a system and the conversations between the pieces matter in a different way to the implementation of the pieces, certainly at the level of testing, but also in terms of the way in which we structure bigger systems, I think. And I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, I think I remember, so I came from a like kind of traditional QA background, and I remember doing manual testing, and we just had this kind of on-prem application and everything was there in a box really for me. And when we moved to distributed systems, we still had to kind of do the same thing, but just now there was all these different components. So I was still trying to ultimately prove the same kind of business value as being performed by the system, but now I had like loads of different moving parts, and actually those moving parts were now they were potentially prone to failure, but they were all being developed by different teams. And what we were finding was when there was issues between these computers, there were frictions between the teams, and there didn't need to be that friction between the teams because we were all just trying to deliver something awesome, or hopefully. Something that, so not just around contract testing, but it was Sam's talk kind of, he talked about the Agile Manifesto. And I think when I first came into computing was around 2007. So I think around the time the Agile Manifesto came out and Ian Fowler was talking about contract testing as kind of a service evolution pattern. Not necessarily around kind of APIs and microservices, but just people are beginning to talk about these kind of great techniques from experiences they'd had in the past. And when you kind of saw and it resonated with you, some of these things, it was a challenge, or I definitely found it a challenge, say, as a tester in my role, really to champion that across my organization and really find, you know, the right people, or to speak the right language to the right people in order to really improve our delivery quality. So not just like contract testing, but say all these great practices we talk about, continuous integration and continuous delivery and kind of all these different points of quality checking at different points of the SDLC. Like, how do you guys work with teams and organizations to elicit that kind of organizational change or shift in mindset towards maybe delivering a better product? Like, someone's coming to you, like they've got this really bad system and like, we need to build something new, and maybe you need to just talk to them and find out what the problem is.
I'm happy to go ahead.
Go ahead. So what you're saying, like, is the problem. You've got to solve a problem. And I think, like, as we all know, like, the end-to-end tests don't scale, the integration tests don't scale. And so that's how I always present it, how I always try and adopt it is, okay, this is the problem that we have, and this is a solution to that problem. So yeah, approaching it from that scaling aspect of, okay, we need our tests to run faster, and we need that feedback faster. So how are we going to achieve that? And coming with the problem is the approach that I take.
Is there and I'm just going to take over, Seth, and ask a question to Lewis.
Yeah, go for it. Honestly, everyone feel free.
No, because what I'm seeing, so the people I work with, so I haven't done a whole lot of consulting around so it's mainly speaking and training. What I found and what I've seen and what I've read is there's still unfortunately a big difference in how well and how easily people who identify themselves as developers understand and are able to implement contract testing compared to the people who identify themselves as testers. I'm just curious about how do you deal with that? Because and especially if we talk about PACT, so about the consumer-driven kind, it's if I run workshops on content, try to get people to get that light bulb in their head, go on, but this is contract testing, this is what it does, and this is the kind of problem that it tries to solve. It's bloody difficult to get that light bulb to go on with the average tester, whereas with the average developer it's much easier. So I was just wondering how you deal with that. How do you tell the story in a different way, or do you say, well, just don't bother with those testers and go straight to the developers? Or
I actually remember a time when, so kind of I was a manual tester and I moved into doing automation testing, and I had some kind of technical experience from not using it in my actual career, but just kind of hobbyist programming. And I used to talk about pushing tests down the stack, and doing more unit tests, but really I wasn't writing unit tests, and I was in a siloed team. So we were in a test team and there was a development team. So we weren't seeing we were seeing a finished product and testing it from the outside in. And we weren't really seeing what the testers were doing, the developers were doing, and what kind of tests they were covering. So I had this kind of narrow view as to what they were covering in their unit tests. So we had integration tests that we were running, and we'd run into failures with just various things that were going wrong. And as we began to talk to the developers and kind of look at what they were doing, we were seeing that there was an overlap in what the kind of testing we were performing. So they weren't just doing this kind of idea of, this unit testing wasn't just this big blob. It wasn't just like they were testing pure functions. They were like component style integration testing. So they were testing how where there's a bounded context. So where a service is, or a component is going to talk to another component. And that's where they were like mocking out a representation of another service. And by mocking out this representation of another service, they could get really quick feedback. They could run their tests repeatably and reliably. And that was something that as a tester, I wasn't able to do in my suite. So I had all these different variables that were changing. And I was like, well, we're kind of doing we're doing the same kind of testing again. And we could actually, these failures that we're finding in the integration testing, we can find them in like lower down in the stack. So actually, if we can get them lower down in the stack, I can make my testing job easier, because most of the, like, if I differentiated the idea of quality checking versus testing, I want these computers to do this kind of checking and this automated low-level stuff. And then I want to be able to use my testing brain, my grey matter, to kind of talk to people and make sure we're developing the right thing. So it's a challenge I find in siloed teams. You really need to be able to know your developer.
No, so it's because we're essentially trying to solve an integration testing, an end-to-end testing problem at the unit testing level, almost. What I find with a lot of a not insignificant subset of the testing orders is that they, as soon as you say, well, we're going to shift this to way early in development, try and address these issues almost at the unit testing level. So, oh, that's what the developers do. We don't do that. When unfortunately it is all about common, and it would be so beneficial if testers would be able to have these conversations with the developers and the rest of the team about what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and then what's the most efficient way. And I know that's one of the reasons that bidirectional contract testing was born, basically, to solve that problem. And I find in my workshop, I typically start talking about consumer-driven contract testing, and you see people, you just see the gears grinding in their heads, and then say, well, and this is a different approach, and that's the bidirectional approach. Oh, but I can do that. It's and almost without exception. So I was just wondering for you, Lewis, Dave, any insights on that? Any tips for this poor chap, maybe on?
I don't know about tips, but I can talk about the way that I approach that kind of thing. And
I'd love to.
And let me just philosophize for a brief moment, because I think that something significant has happened through the course of this century, rather than software development up until it. I think we've had a transition, and I think that we are at the birth of a genuine first-class engineering discipline for software development. I think that we now know what works better than other ways of doing things. And a lot of what we're talking about is part of that. Things like continuous integration, test-driven development, contract testing. These are the tools that allow us to do some of these things. Now, for me, the way in which I kind of solve problems, whether in consultancy or in software development, is by applying some of these, what I think of as foundational principles. One of the foundational principles, two principles that matter deeply to me, I think, is first of all, I think that we should redefine what quality in software means to mean one thing. It's our ability to change the software. If your software is easy to change, it's high quality. If it's hard to change, it's low quality. And I know there's lots of other things that matter other than only that, but you don't get those other things unless you can change the software.
Agreed.
The only other alternative to being able to change the software is to get everything perfectly right first time. And nobody can do that in modern systems. So quality is the absolute goal. The other idea that I think is foundational in this context is the idea of working more experimentally. And part of working more experimentally is to control the variables. So we need to, in order to do better engineering, we've got to exert more control over the variables. So when we're talking about things like contract testing is a deep player in our ability to control the variables. We can isolate whole parts of the system and get rid of worrying about those things. And through architecture and design and contract testing, we can make the piece that we're working on easy to change without worrying about the impact in other areas of the system. So this stuff really matters. And then practically, in terms of how we get people to start to buy into this, I think it's about. I think somebody said, I can't remember if it was Lewis or Yusuf, but somebody said something about optimizing to increase the feedback or faster feedback. And I think that's deeply part of it. So our aim is to be able to spot when we make a change, whether that's good or not. And that's part of keeping our software easy to change. And we get that feedback by having things like contract tests. So we can potentially, there are other ways, alternatives to it, but that's one of the tools in our toolbox to achieve that really fast feedback. So I tend to talk about the principles like this to my clients, but I also say practically, your goal is to get to optimize for fast feedback, and I put some limits on it. I say, if we on commit in a deployment pipeline, I want feedback in under 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So how you achieve that, from the commit stage in under 5 minutes. Depends on the software. Sometimes contract testing is part of that. Sometimes it's not. But for bigger systems, more distributed systems, contract testing is a fantastic tool to make that easier to achieve. So that's the way that I tend to approach it. I tend to have what I think of as a logical arguments as to how you build up these things and maximize these deeper principles that I think our disciplines built upon, and then you take advantage of those, and that they help you to choose the tools in the context in which you're working.
Agree.
Have any advice just for the general testing community who still? I love that answer, by the way, Dave. I wholeheartedly agree, but there's a lot of people I know in the testing community who say, well, that's really something that developers should take care of, and that we're happy to do some kind of acceptance testing and see if it all works according to the end user expectation specifications and see if there are any problems there.
What if I was to say something contentious? So a tester's job isn't to find bugs, and a tester's merit isn't determined by the code that they write, like the testing code that they write. So you employ developers, they're great at writing code. They're great at solving, well, first and foremost, they should be great at solving problems. And if those problems warrant code, then they should write code. Yeah. But ideally, great problem solvers will try and think smart, work harder, work smarter, not harder. So if you can not code yourself, not get into worrying about building some software that's going to be complex to change in the future, don't do it. The other thing is, like, so I remember going into a client site in a consultancy. I had this imposter syndrome. I was the only tester in a team of 8 developers, and I'd never had this kind of disparity before. I was like, it used to be siloed tester. I'm like, I'm going to have all this weight on my shoulders trying to be the purveyor of gatekeeper of quality. And then I realized, like, that's not my role. And Dave, you said about principles, right? And getting to know your team and getting to know what ticks for them is really great, because once you know what works for other people, you can talk to them in the way that, you know, they want to be talked to. So I was like, right, I've got all these things that I care about in testing. Let's just sit down with these 8 developers and find out what they care about testing. And I found out that there was different types of testing I hadn't thought of before, like mutation testing, for example, at a unit testing level. So we all shared all this stuff on the board, and then we just had a chat about it. And alongside this, there was kind of this idea that the teams would own their software through to deployment. So they would deploy their own software, and because they're deploying their own software, they would have to write, they didn't want to test it every time when it was deployed in production, so they put these little tests and stuff in place, and they'd always be using like this little, I used to think like they had this little mini SAP in their head that was just always kind of just telling them, this board that we had, that just had these kind of principles of things we care about. And then because everyone had these as principles, it was really easy at review time to say, hey, you know, we haven't done X, Y, and Z, you know, so we're going to do them because that's our definition of done. So it's difficult.
It's I think you're right. It is difficult, but the other part of this is that this idea of optimizing for feedback is deeper than it seems. I think when you start to really dig into it, and what you said resonated with me. I was kind of nodding and smiling as you were speaking about, you know, it's not the job of a tester to gatekeep access to production. If you're employing your testers in that way, in my view, you're doing it wrong. So, you know, there's a fairly famous quote from Edward Deming, from the grandfather of lean manufacturing, who said, "You can't inspect quality into a product; you have to build it in." And so, you know, in order for you know, the job, you know, depending on what labels you apply to people, whether you call people QA or testers or whatever, I think the job in both cases is to up the level of quality in the products that we build. And you don't do that by doing lots of testing, as you described in your kind of your anti-pattern case earlier on. You know, after the software is finished, you do it as part of building it. So you want really fast feedback, and the way that you get that is you get the testing right up and front and center. So I'm a BDD person. So I want specifications more than tests. You know. And you know, if somebody finds a bug after I've built it, that's a failure on my part. It's not somebody else's job to find the bugs. You know, it's my job as a member of a software development team, and that takes all different kinds of skills. So you need these cross-functional teams. You need testing thinking up front and center as part of the development process, and engaged with the process of actually building the software, and people looking at it from a testing point of view as other people maybe are constructing that software and it's growing. You know, you don't wait until the end. You don't build mini waterfalls of testing after the feature's finished, for example. Yeah. In my view,
you can test quality into a product. And something that you mentioned there about specifications, I think is really pertinent, I think, in the API space, and leads quite nicely into something Bas was saying about bidirectional, and also what Sam was saying about schema checking. So there's lots of great kind of mechanisms now for describing different services depending on the transport protocols. So we'll take one, for example, say OpenAPI. So, and we now kind of might suggest that if you're creating a RESTful service, you might want to document it in OpenAPI, and therefore you can benefit from kind of a human readable aspect in a nice UI, or a machine readable aspect that computers can use for various purposes. So there's a open source tool that was built by Atlassian to solve some of their problems with their pact verifications. So rather than replaying their consumer contracts against a live provider, they would replay them against this specification, this OpenAPI specification. So many people like this feature. It's kind of been packaged up into the bidirectional feature in Pact, but a lot of people are beginning to sometimes they think that that's kind of enough for their testing. So for me, I think there's two, when we're talking about contract testing, maybe it's not so, maybe people conflate that with just consumer driven contract testing. So we're looking at
definitely
consumer, what the consumer needs from a provider, but actually there's this idea of, well, if we're going to present this specification that says this is what my service will do, we've kind of got a job in checking that presentation of that specification is actually correct. compared to our implementation. So that's kind of the provider. You could have this provider drift. So you ideally want a contract between that specification and your provider implementation. And then wider than that, could we argue that every test is a contract?
I know I'm talking too much, but I think there's something important there that I'd like to get to. As we're moving forwards with growing this engineering discipline and being able to specify these things that we want, but really what we're talking about here is this is what measurement is for software. The tests, the specifications that we build are measuring the software. So one of the things that contract testing does is it allows us to insert a measurement point into a point in the system where we can measure more accurately and more precisely. And one of the things with measurement in other engineering disciplines is you have ideas of tolerances, and I think that what we're talking about here, when we're talking about these multi-direction contract tests, is really the tolerances. We want to be able to again protect our ability to maintain the contracts that we hold between different parts of the system, and we want some kind of tolerance, allow some levels of drift between them. And what the contracts do is that they assert that we are within our tolerance, and if we move outside, something breaks, and we know that we can't put those pieces together. And I think that's quite an important idea, and I like to keep putting it back to these engineering ideas, because I think there's something profound about those that really matters in terms of us being able to do a better job. And when we think in those ways, we can sometimes come up with newer and different ideas. And there's this boundary between testing, always to me in its engineering sense as a measurement, and the architectures that it drives us towards as a result. I think contract testing has changed some of the ways in which some people think about how to partition systems for the better, in good ways, I think.
I would 100% agree. For me, it fundamentally changed the way that I think about developing software. And I was actually fortunate in the team where we kind of moved from the on-prem to Lambdas and serverless. And I actually had the good fortune of being able to partake in developing rather than testing, and I actually got to feel firsthand some of the pains of developing software, and actually how some of the bugs and defects that you find fundamentally change the way that you approach developing software. Do you think that teams need to feel the pain of their systems not talking to each other, or the pain of their systems not working in production, to really value that the time and effort and energy they're putting into testing? Because some people are like, just build something, put it into production, fail fast. But what does that actually mean?
I think that's one way of learning. I think if again we sort of think as engineering as an organizing principle, it's not the best way of learning, because it means that everybody's got to make all of the mistakes. And it'd be nice to be able to build on the shoulders of giants and not make some of the mistakes that people previously did. At the moment, we're still at the stage where pretty much everybody has to make all of the mistakes. And I would rather that as a discipline we grew up a bit and started to get to, let's just agree, some of these deeper principles and just rely on them a little bit more, and then we can do more. We can start going further. The mistake, one of the things that always surprises me, there's a book written in 1970 called The Mythical Man Month. If you just take the bits where it talks about the actual computer systems and read it, it's all completely true about what's software development today. If you just ignore the actual details of the systems that they're building. So we're still making the same mistakes as we were making in 1970. So let's find new ways to make mistakes and find ways of improving practice. And I think that's what I mean when I say that we are doing some of that. I think that some of the lessons that we have learned, including tools like contract testing, are starting to move the game on, but it's slow. And I hope that we can get past everybody making the same mistakes over and over again. and that being the only way to learn.
Yeah, that resonates for me. Right, so we've got some great questions that have come in from our audience in the time being. I think it might lead on to what you talk about. So great to talk about all these different kind of that we should kind of think about these guiding principles. So I assume our guests are all familiar with the testing pyramid. Yeah. Do you think that's still a helpful concept that guides you, or are there any other paradigms that kind of you're using at the moment? I'm
happy to say that, but I'd let Lewis go first, because I know you've got something to say about that.
Yeah, so I definitely still use it as a guide, but yeah, I definitely don't use it in the pyramid perspective. I think like technology's moved on a long way, and we can get fast feedback from our higher level tests, and yeah, we think about testing from a different way, like than we did before. So I think like we've definitely moved on from the pyramid, but I think it's still a good guide. And like when you think about contract testing, we talk about it falling in line just in between that integration and that unit layer. So it's a good guide to say, okay, contract testing kind of slides nicely into there, but it's definitely not a pyramid. Like I like to use the kind of Spotify honeycomb where you have lots of integration tests, and I think that's where we've talked a lot about the challenges of communication, and I think that's heavily where we should have our tests, right? And then you start to think about how fast can we get that feedback, and at what layers. But yeah, I definitely think focusing more on the communication layer is key, and adds a lot more value than having loads of unit tests.
Well, I can really only say, well, that's very, very much in line with what I think about that thing. By the way, it's always been a triangle. So let's just get that out of the way first. It's not a pyramid. It has always been a triangle. But anyway, it's for me, it's both way past its sell date and still a very good conversation starter about just what you said, Lewis. It is, we as testers, we are in the business of uncovering and presenting information about quality and potential problems around our software. And the most important, the only important thing is that how can I get that information in as efficient a way as possible? That's what we are. And that triangle model helps me introduce the different ways and the different layers and the different scopes of doing tests, performing tests, writing tests, running tests in, and the only advice I typically give is this: just don't do something, don't try and uncover that information with an end-to-end test or an integration test if you can get it at a unit test level. And I think contract testing is just one of the, so I've been in this not nearly as long as you, Dave, but I've been in this in this business for some 17 years now, and this is contract testing thing is one of the very, very few truly, I was going to say new, but it's not even new, but the truly different approaches to trying to find an answer to that question of, are there any problems with our software? So by actually breaking down that big puzzle, that big question of, are all of these different services and components and layers and whatever in our system able to communicate with one another? And by breaking that down into smaller steps that are more efficient to execute. So
okay, so I'm very, very sorry to disagree with the rest of our lovely panel. I am something of a natural heretic, and this is one of my heresies. I'm not a fan of the testing pyramid or triangle as Bas correctly points out. There's something that people find helpful there. I concede that. But I think it's the wrong shape, and I think it's the wrong piece of advice. And at the very best, it's a retrospective view. Are you going to not write a really helpful acceptance test because you've got too many of those?
Right.
That seems like a really stupid idea to me.
So first, I definitely don't disagree. So I'm pretty sure what you're going to be saying is not as contradictory or to what I was thinking or trying to say. So
Sure.
I think
sorry, you're not as much of a heretic as you think you. At least, well, not in this particular.
Not here. Cool.
No, not here right now.
Cool.
We've got time left. So
Elliot's posted up. All models are wrong. Some are useful.
Indeed, absolutely, and you know, one of my personal principles is that I always starting out assume that I'm wrong. So I'm not really nervous about being a heretic. I'm okay if people disagree with me. That's not a problem. I don't assume that I'm necessarily right, but I want to say what it is that I like to express what it is that I think about these things. And I don't think it's right. The best testing that I have ever seen on any project wasn't pyramid shaped, wasn't triangular, it was more like an hourglass. We had loads of unit tests, tens of thousands, and we had loads of acceptance tests because we were doing test-driven development, and we were using acceptance tests to drive executable specifications for every single feature. So we had tens of thousands of those. We had tens of thousands of unit tests. We had almost no integration tests because the acceptance tests did the job of those. We also had a whole bunch of contract tests for isolating and faking out external third parties. So that was, that looked nothing like a testing pyramid. But on that project, we were 13 months and 5 days after our first release into production before anybody found a bug. I mean, what do you want? Our job is to build good software. It's not to build good, perfect pyramids or triangles of tests. So it might be a useful tool. I've never found it very informative. I don't believe, so I think it overrepresents what I think of integration tests, because I think integration tests largely are tactical. They're not part of my default test strategy. My default test strategy is built on acceptance tests, executable specifications of the behavior of the whole system, the releasable unit of software, and unit tests. And I would have loads of unit tests. I'm a test-driven developer, so I'm going to have lots of unit tests, and that's but I'm also going to have lots of acceptance tests. So I'm not a big fan of the testing pyramid at all, and I've railed against it a few times because I think it can lead people into to misguided views about what to test. My view is that I want to find a way of testing everything. These are our measurements. These are how we tell that our software is good. So I want to test everything. And depending on the nature of the project or the system or the team or whatever, that might change what I choose as part of the testing strategy. But it's got built on, is my software releasable? And does it do what I think it does? That's fundamentally, those are the driving principles. How
do you define testing everything? Because one of the things I keep finding myself saying is, instead of trying to test everything, why don't we start trying to test as little as we can get away with?
So we've actually just had a few comments in on our YouTube channel. One from Anto at Treatwell, who was actually in our last community session. So he said, and it's quite nice, it rolls into around the principles. So and Anto said, personally, especially in the world of distributed architecture, I prefer these principles to the pyramid. So favor small and pre-deployment tests over large and post-deployment tests. Favor in-memory representations of stateful dependencies over deployed instances. And I think this one's really point to your point, is test just at the right level for what you want to verify. So you'll get loads of different feedback from these different levels. So if I'm writing a little CLI application, before I start writing some tests, I'm probably going to run it end to end and, you know, get that really rich feedback just to see that it works. But as I start building that system up, that complexity of change will, you know, exponentially grow if I don't put those kind of tests in a different layer. So finding that balance of testing the right amount at the right level. One thing I use is testing quadrants, because I got into the idea of testing being everyone's responsibility. So the testing quadrants just allow me to think about things I use to guide my development and things I use to evaluate my product, and then also try and think about them from two different aspects. So kind of the developer facing aspect of it, so what it costs my developers to change it, and then the business kind of facing the impact, what's the cost of change for the business and the impact on users. Right, so I think we might have a couple more questions.
I just while you're looking at those, I just wanted to touch on the testing everything. There's a good example. So I think this is right about strategically. It's about picking the levels at which you test things. I like to pick codes out to use as kind of counter examples, you know, bad examples sometimes. And there's a code from one of the well-known open source continuous integration systems that there's a test that I found there that's about, I don't know, about 150 lines of test in one badly named test. And when you kind of pick it apart and figure out what it's doing, it's starting up the entire application, and it's doing that in order to tell that it doesn't proceed if it's got localhost in the URL in the configuration. You can do that in a unit test. So you should do that in the unit test, and that's all you need to do. You don't have to test everything in all of the levels. So finding the levels is right and important, I think. And then I think that part of the reason that Bas is alluding to in terms of not wanting to test everything is that there's a focus often from, if you're thinking about this from a testing point of view rather than a specification point of view, there's a difference. Mm-hmm. If I'm trying to specify what I want the software to do at every level in my testing, that automatically limits how many tests I need in order to express that. So this is behavior-driven development, but kind of fractal. It's at all levels of testing, and I think that's the best way to organize tests on the whole. And so nearly all of my tests are sort of BDD shaped. They're expressing what the system needs to do without saying anything, as little as humanly possible as I can achieve, without saying anything about how the system actually works.
Yeah,
and then
as soon as you have to start updating those tests as you update your system, you know, start you marking your own homework.
So I think that's one of the techniques to kind of sensibly manage the scale of the tests that you're having, but still test all of the behaviors that you can think of.
Incredible. Right, we've only got 3 minutes left, so not sure if we're gonna have time for any more questions. So maybe I'll just leave with that's been incredibly insightful. I could talk to you guys for hours, but how can the rest of the world keep in contact with each of you if they want to either continue the conversation or hear about some of your learnings? So I'll go with Lewis first, my friend.
Yeah, you can always reach out to me at pacman.co.uk or on the Dying X platform, or just reach out to me on LinkedIn, or in the Pact Slack, of course.
And you can also, if you want to hear more from Bas and Lewis or other contract testing and just general awesome people within the quality and testing community, give a listen to Lewis's podcast. So over to you, Bas.
I've been not on the You can't find me probably, or at least not me, on that platform formerly known as Twitter.
I tried to find you earlier today, but I couldn't.
No, there's good reason for. But LinkedIn works nicely. Packed Slack too, or through my own site on testautomation.com.
Awesome. And if people want to check out, they can, I think there's plenty of YouTube videos or courses they can catch up online for yourself.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah, so be sure to check out On Test Automation. And Dave, you've got loads of stuff in store. What's happening?
So I am currently on the platform with that nobody wants to name. Dave Farley 77. Don't know for how much longer, but I'm there at the moment. I'm on Mastodon as well at Tech Social, same handle. And if you go to YouTube and search for continuous delivery, you'll find my channel. There's lots of stuff there, including videos specifically on contract testing and on the role of testers and QA.
Fantastic. And if we have any potential budding speakers in the audience, I'm sure they can all get in touch with you and potentially connect. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, gentlemen. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for all your work you've done within the just testing community and development community, sharing good practices and principles. And I hope to be here in another 10 years, and hopefully that AI hasn't taken over the world. Right.
Thank you, sir.
Well, thanks
so much for having us.
And I'll hand back to the lovely Elliot.